Welcome to, everybody, welcome to the seminar for today. This is our third seminar, and we'll have several more over the course of the term. Our speaker today is Professor Konrad Schindler, who's from ETH Zurich. He's been working in the area of remote sensing and 3D point cloud extraction using photogrammetry for many years. He's been his PhD from almost 25 years ago. And today he's unfortunately not able to make it in person, but we're really looking forward to his talk on remote sensing and photogrammetry. And there's a really amazing body of work that he's been doing at ETH. In fact, he was a supervisor for Yihan Shil here, which is where we got the recommendation from. So looking forward to the talk. Konrad, sorry you're not here in person. If you were here, we'd be taking a review afterwards, but for your thoughts. So thank you very much. Looking forward to it. It's all yours.
Okay. Can you hear me? Is the sound working well?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction. Indeed, it's a shame that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm still honored to be invited, and I'm also, it sort of completes a missing gap. So I've given talks in Oxford and Imperial and UCL and everywhere around you, basically, but somehow never in Cambridge. So this is the first time. I hope it works out. So I've been asked to briefly give a broader overview of our work that we've been doing recently, and then afterwards concentrate on one topic that I talk about in a bit more depth. And that's what I'm going to do. Just to start with, how long should I make it so that I don't grossly overstep my time?
40 minutes would be good.
Okay. So then we'll go pretty quick in the beginning. And if you have any questions about all those other projects, just ask afterwards, because I think it's better not to waste time on introducing everyone in detail. So this is my research group. Modulo a few changes. As always, these group photos are slightly outdated. This one is from our last group retreat last winter. And so what we do is essentially the processing part of remote sensing. So I'm not going to talk much about sensors and sending satellites to space and things like that, or building laser scanners, but I'm going to talk about the bit that once these sensors give you observations, how do you somehow create a box, a computational system that outputs whatever information it is that you're actually interested in. So this is, well, environmental computer vision or Earth observation or whatever you want to call it. And I'll first start with a little overview of projects just to give you a portfolio, and then we'll go into one in more depth, as I said. So we are quite interested in all sorts of environmental applications, especially for overland and for vegetation. This is an example of mapping the oil palms, so those trees on which the palm oil for soaps and Nutella grows in Southeast Asia, which is a big agricultural commodity, but one that is not very well documented and has some issues. It also has some advantages, like being actually the most area efficient fat crop, but it also has the disadvantage that to grow it, people often cut down rainforest, which is of course not so desirable. And it also has a big economic impact, and therefore it was sort of interesting to know where it grows and how much of it grows where. And we essentially did it by with a active learning deep network system, regressing the density of trees, the number of trees per pixel, and ran this over large scale. And a similar project, more Switzerland related even, this is for the cocoa part of the chocolate. So not only the palm oil, also the cocoa is of course grown predominantly in one region of the world. This is West Africa. These two countries that you see are Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And that's where much of our cocoa is grown. And again, it's not clear where it's grown. The production statistics are grossly off. And the supply chains are extremely opaque and unclear. And so we try to clarify that a bit by at least finding out where the cocoa plantations are. And that's a map. It's a probabilistic map. That's why it has this shading. So basically yellow means high probability that it is cocoa. And the funny black geometric shapes in between are the forest reserves where there's still no cocoa because they left the trees standing. In Switzerland, we've done agricultural crops too. This is, of course, more in the sense of, integrated production and subsidies and all that. So there it's a time series analysis. You take those time signatures, sequences of images, and try to analyze them with some clever dynamic models, because it's really the change, the sort of development that creates a visual signature in images. It doesn't help you to see a brown pixel or a green pixel. What helps you is to see how these mostly annual crops develop over the year, over the growing season, to keep them apart. One more map of Switzerland. This is the snow depth in the Alps, which we can produce at a weekly basis, also from satellite images, of course, including auxiliary information. You need the terrain, for example, because the insolation and the sliding and setting of the snow and everything depends on the slope and on the exposure. And this is again a sort of a time series model. So image 2D in space and 1D in time along the temporal axis, where we sort of model the development of the snow as a function of the images and also the underlying terrain. This can be then updated regularly with some tricks to keep a running sort of mosaic of the most recent valid pixels without clouds. And this was done together with a company actually, and will hopefully soon be rolled out. Another topic, not so much on the environmental side, is we're also working in the humanitarian sector. There are two projects I want to briefly mention. One is about mapping population density in developing countries. So essentially providing the International Committee of the Red Cross with detailed hectare level maps of where the people are, so that you can have targeted efforts to do vaccination campaigns, disaster relief, and whatnot. Because in those places, of course, the population dynamics is high, the census is relatively rare and very coarse, and it's important to somehow better know where the people are, how they're reachable, how the population is distributed, and we do that also based on satellite imagery. And another project from the humanitarian sector that is unfortunately a bit on the tragic side, this is a mapping war damage also for the Red Cross and for UNOSAT. First of all, for their support efforts, but also because they are charged with or have the mandate of documenting war crimes. So damaged buildings due to shelling and other war-related activities. We wrote this project 2 years ago, and at the time wrote into the proposal that Ukraine would be a great example because there's no hot conflict and there are observers on the ground and we could get good data. And unfortunately, the world has developed differently, but we're still mapping Ukraine, of course. Bit of close range. So this is laser scanning data, as you can see, pretty high quality, acquired from drones. And the context here is precision forestry. So people want to really at the single tree level understand their forests so that they can do targeted measures of first for extraction and timber production, but also conservation to keep the ecosystem intact. And for that, these things need to be structured and understood. In this case, this is instance segmentation. So that's assigning the points to individual trees. And so then you can derive biophysical attributes like the volume of the crown and the diameter of the trunk and things that are important for forest managers, which is done with a 3D variant of a deep network here. Few more exotic things, just because they're fashionable, so some of you might be able to relate to them. LiDAR, when you're working with 3D laser point clouds with these big clouds of irregularly distributed points, you always have an issue with the AI type systems that you need a lot of training data, and then people try to simulate that. Actually, autonomous driving companies have entire departments that build simulators so that they can create synthetic training data. And we've been working on how to make those more realistic by essentially combining this implicit neural radiance field idea with the physically correct modeling of an active LiDAR sensor and building a sort of sensor-specific bespoke nerve system. This is not because we're also working on autonomous driving, we're rarely doing that, but it was easier as a starting point because there are nice curated data sets that we could start from, whereas in the forestry domain, that is a lot harder to obtain, at least with large volume. So here you see a 3D visualization of when you move the camera, and all this is not by explicit ray tracing, but by pulling out the points from this neural radiance field. Okay, some more things. So this is more structuring, understanding of the world for robotics. I think we can skip that. Some of you, if anybody is interested in 3D from single images, you might have seen a system called Midas. This is maybe more of an engineering feat than science, but with the advent of learning and therefore sort of associative memory in computers, if you like, we've really made inroads and suddenly been able to model the 3D structure of the world from single images, which is something that to a good degree is possible, as you can easily verify by just looking at the world with one eye. And computers were notoriously unable to do it. And now they are able to do it, but there was sort of scattered efforts here and there that had a few impressive pictures, but it was very hard to really use it as a commodity. And so we set out together with the Intel labs to make an out-of-the-box system that is well-trained, and you can just take it and apply it to your image, and it works in most situations. And that got quite popular and is used by many people. By now, of course, as a baseline, so they are also proving that they're better than we are a bit, but that's the sort of the purpose of it, so no problem with that. In 3D, we've lately been working on articulated structures too, or articulated subjects. In this case, we did dogs. So humans are relatively easy to model because they're very cooperative. You call them to the lab and you capture yoga teachers doing their stuff so that you have nice dynamic 3D models. Dogs are a bit less cooperative there, so you somehow have to make do with a lot worse data, just images. And for that, of course, you also need to somehow construct a model. So that's a hybrid between a learned statistical approach for the perception part, but actually an explicit three-dimensional articulated model, mesh type computer graphics model of the dog to constrain that system enough to regress a 3D pose just from pixels. It doesn't have to be dogs. You can, of course, do this with others, but dogs just are a sweet spot for a research project because they're relatively challenging in terms of shape. They have a big variability of shapes due to breeding. On the other side, they're still manageable because they don't deform as crazily as, for example, cats. And on top of that, people love them, so it's easy to find a lot of images. Hello? Okay. And then with this, I come to the project or to the main topic of the talk. This is about creating a canopy height map of the entire Earth at high resolution. And it's an example of something that in computer science, you actually see quite rarely, or in computer vision, which is a student who was so determined and so patient that they worked on the same topic, pushing it further and further for 4 years because they had a dream of what they wanted to make happen at the end, and it really worked out. So we're quite proud of this project. The last paper of it just came out 2 or 3 weeks ago in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. So that's 5 years after Nico started his PhD. He has moved on by now, but we still like the project. So I guess we don't need to have a long discussion that forests are important. Also the UN with the Sustainable Development Goals and so on acknowledges that, and they actually have global forest goals. So there are some goals to increase the forest area by 3% by 2030 or something. We're unfortunately not on target for that, as little as with other climate goals or biodiversity goals. But in order to manage the forest and also to understand it at a large scale, put it into regional models and so on, we obviously need to know something about it. And we'll start with the perhaps simplest indicator, but the one that we so far could do at really large scale beyond just present or absence of trees, and that is the height of the trees. So we want to map the canopy height. This is how trees are usually surveyed. So you go in the forest, you take laser scanners, or you climb up the trees in extreme cases like here, and you measure diameters and heights, and obviously that doesn't scale very well. And so what does scale better was the question. The gold standard for doing this in a, not per tree, but over larger areas is airborne LiDAR, or perhaps photogrammetric stereo mapping, but also that doesn't scale. You cannot fly an airborne LiDAR over the entire landmass of the Earth. If you take the land masses of the Earth minus Antarctica, that's about 135 million square kilometers. So it will be very expensive to do that. On top of that, you need so many airplanes that you probably have a very negative impact already with your mapping campaign. So maybe we don't want to do that. And so we looked further, and then there are two sources of information that we sort of could get our hands on. One is a space-borne LiDAR. We'll talk about it, but colleagues from NASA and the University of Maryland have actually mounted a laser ranging instrument on the International Space Station called GEDI that gives us point-wise measurements, but it doesn't densely cover the area. And then, of course, our go-to source of information, satellite images. Those do cover the entire Earth repeatedly, very systematically, but the issue with them is you can actually not directly read the height out of them. They are from a single vertical viewpoint. You see the trees from the top, but it's very hard to understand their height. But we can nevertheless estimate them, and that's what this talk will essentially be about. And just for completeness, because some people ask about that, I guess it's quite obvious that there is no easy equation, no physical model that you can write down that relates the radiation, the color in red, green, and blue, and infrared, and so on, to the height of a tree. So the relation to invert is not analytically known. There is no nice physical law, and therefore we have to just hammer at it with statistics and machine learning. I'll structure this in 3 steps. The first step is how do you do canopy height from images? The second is how do you get a global reference data source? And the third is how do you combine them together? So this is the first one, which is sort of the methodological core of the whole thing. I don't know, are people familiar with Earth observation satellites and satellite imaging?
Yeah, generally,
sorry.
in this room, most people are, I think.
Okay.
In this room, most people, and also satellites.
Okay, so what we're using is Sentinel-2. You've seen it probably, one of the European Earth observation Copernicus satellites, records multispectral data in the optical and near infrared and shortwave infrared range. Pixel size of the highest resolution channels, which are only 4, the colors and the broadband near infrared, is 10-meter ground sampling distance, but it covers the globe. Like a clock, it comes over where you are every 3 to 5 days, depending on where you are on Earth, and records an image. So you get a very nice coverage, and it actually covers the entire planet. And that is our input data source. But that's what it looks like. As you've seen it, I've given you a RGB composite, so the visible channels. On the left side, you see that the resolution is sort of good enough to see forest. You clearly see where the trees are. On the right side, I've zoomed in, so that's the native resolution. That's the best you can get from that sensor, or that's what it really delivers. And looking at it, you see the trees, but most people will agree that it's very hard to guess how high they are from that perspective and with that resolution. So it seems a bit daring, but it turns out that a regression system, a neural network, can actually do that. And it's a crazy situation because despite all our efforts, we are not entirely sure yet how it does it. We don't know what carries the signal. Is it shadowing patterns? Is it the change of infrared response with height that has to do with how much water is at what height of the tree? Is it implicit recognition of plant communities? We don't know what really is this signal. Nevertheless, it works. And that is a sort of an unsatisfactory situation, but also a strength, because without the statistical monster, we couldn't have done it at all, because we have no way of writing down a relation of which we don't know what it is. So the way we do it is purely data-driven. This is a big regression system, a neural network consisting of convolutional layers, with separable convolutions, many layers. I think 34 is the standard configuration, but it can be scaled up and down for computational efficiency versus a little edge in performance. You stick in the sentinel bands. They go through a sequence of convolutions with some specialties for remote sensing. So for example, you should not have a lot of downsampling and loss of high frequency detail because the objects are small. So you don't use a lot of pooling and striding. And then at the end of it, of this encoder decoder network, as they call it, you get out a map of the same resolution. So a value for every pixel in space, and that value is the canopy height. And that is trained with a normal regression loss. So you have some training examples. They, in this case, come from airborne LiDAR. So they have been produced with airplanes locally in some places, and or with photogrammetry, so with 3D stereo vision. And those values form the targets, the training ground truth, and you just minimize a normal regression loss until the network parameters have converged, and then you have this predictor model. We've tested that, developed that originally on only 2 countries, of course, not the entire world. And those 2 countries are chosen. On the one hand, it's Gabon. Gabon is a country in tropical Africa on the equator with particularly high forest and huge forage coverage. Like 90% of the country is covered by trees above 25 meters tall. And there are ground truth data. So these yellow squares that you see, that's where, in the course of developing this satellite or space LiDAR that we'll come to in a minute, NASA has flown some verification campaigns with airborne full waveform LiDAR there. So we have data over these yellow areas where we know the vegetation height. And the second one is Switzerland, first of all, because that's where we are at home. And we like to show it, of course, to people locally here because it's something they can relate to. And also, we have colleagues who can help us with verifying our map and understanding the maps better at the Swiss Institute for Forest and Landscape Research. And they also, from the National Forest Inventory, have heights. They have them everywhere. The 2 yellow blocks are chosen to be from the same year because they don't cover the entire country every year. And we wanted to have them from the same year. And the results of that regression system, so the way we show those here are these correlation plots. So the color denotes density, right? The redder, the darker red, the higher the count of pixels that fall into this bin. And the bins in these 2D histograms are, the vertical axis is the predicted height, and the horizontal axis is the real true height that you're supposed to predict. So ideally, all the points would lie on this diagonal, on this unit diagonal, which would then mean, well, if the model says 24 meters, then it is actually 24 meters. And you see that the correlation is pretty good. Of course, not perfect. There's a certain uncertainty in this. On top of that, there are slight biases. Like for very high trees, the models tend to underpredict because there's a saturation effect. It's not as bad as it used to be in the old days, but still we cannot reliably differentiate, say, a 60 from an 80-meter high tree. And then we applied this and made countrywide maps. Here you see the one for Gabon. And just to see that this is really a step forward, I show you what was the previous standard go-to map for large-scale vegetation studies. That's the one on the right that Patrice Simard made about 10 or 12 years ago. The ground resolution is 1 kilometer, so it's coarse by itself. But on top of that, it has a much stronger saturation effect and never goes really high, not above 20 meters or so. And in the middle, that's ours. These yellow extreme values near the coast, up here, if you can see my mouse pointer, those are actually correct. These are the highest mangrove trees that exist in the world, that grow anywhere in the world, in Bongara National Park in Gabon. Those are mangroves that grow to 65 or 70 meters tall. Yeah, and for Switzerland, we could also evaluate it. Of course, here the trees are not so tall, but there were other challenges that we wanted to verify because it's a mountainous country. We have very steep slopes, and there are different issues with shadowing, with defining where the ground is, and so on. Bottom line of this is it pretty much worked. We were happy, and we asked ourselves, how can we scale this to the world? But then we need reference data that's distributed around the globe. And that brings me to the second part, which is the GEDI campaign. So for this, which is work together with the people who designed, started GEDI, I'll first show you the video. This is a video, promotion video made by NASA. This is the International Space Station in its orbit, still flying around. And here on the instrument pod, they have mounted this thing. This looks like approximately like a fridge in terms of size. So it's like 1.5 by 2.5 meters or so. And it contains laser pointers, but very big ones. So they shoot from the space station to the Earth. The footprint of a single laser dot is about 25 meters. And with those, you measure the return waveform. So the thing is, of course, reflected, runs to the ground, is reflected, runs back, and you have a little camera that sees that light dot, or rather the intensity of the light, and measures this waveform. And like with a terrestrial laser scanner, you can from this invert the tree height, hopefully, because you get reflections from the canopy, but also from the ground. So that's what these waveforms look like. So if the vertical here is the time, which equates to elevation if you know the speed of light, and you get these intensity profiles, and the goal is essentially to say where's the canopy top and where's the ground in this waveform, and the difference of the two gives you the height. Now, of course, the people in Maryland made their own retrieval algorithms for this. The problem is they were not globally consistent. They were not the same everywhere, but they made 5 different ones for different biomes and backgrounds. And what's more, they didn't say which one works where. They just say one of them probably works, and you just try them out and find the one that works for your region. And that is, of course, problematic if we want to do something that's seamless around the globe. So we ended up doing our own retrieval. Technologically very similar. So we take a one-dimensional CNN, a convolutional network with just 1 dimension along time instead of 2D kernels. And with that, we regress the height of the trees from the waveform, so from this 1D signal. And since we knew that there was quite a bit of uncertainty involved in that, and we wanted not to lose that information, we do some probabilistic deep learning. So we run multiple such networks. They're trained independently due to the stochastics that ends up giving you very different parameters, which you can see as samples from the distribution of parameters in a Bayesian sense. And then you can do ensembling of them and compute sort of a mean prediction and also a spread, so a standard deviation of those predictions. On top of that, we also train them with a probabilistic loss function. So the loss is not just the residual, the distance between the prediction and the ground truth, but it is actually a sort of log likelihood function of a Gaussian, so that you estimate or output also the standard deviation. You essentially give the model the possibility to say this error, this particular large error is down-weighted. I divide it by the variance because I know that I'm uncertain. So I'm allowed to sort of reduce my overall error by increasing the variance. But then there's a penalty for large variances because otherwise it would just say I'm uncertain everywhere. And with this loss function that has a clear probabilistic interpretation, it's just a log of the normal distribution. Then you can make these probabilistic predictions very nicely. And we had the reference data set where waveforms from GEDI were given and very exactly co-registered ground-based heights from laser scanning. This was from the campaign that was done with airplanes, with the so-called Elvis campaign, which is there to calibrate these waveforms from space. The distribution is unfortunately not perfect. There are entire regions of the Earth, like most of Asia and South America, where there's no data, and then in North America and Australia, and there's a lot of it. But nevertheless, it's what we got, and we had all these waveforms and trained the network to predict from GEDI to tree height. Again, here you have this correlation plot, so you see it works reasonably well. The correlation is the yellow in this case for the high density is on the diagonal where it should be. Moreover, the uncertainties that we estimate also make sense. So they correlate with the actual error. And if we cut off, if we say discard the 20 or 30 or whatever most uncertain samples, the error goes down. So it's indeed so that those which are flagged as the most uncertain are also the most uncertain. So if you take them out of the set, then your average gets better. Here is the map. This had to be aggregated. So those laser points, as I said, are sparse. They're only every couple of kilometers. So plotting them raw, you wouldn't see anything. So what we've done is we've cut the Earth into little squares of 1/2 degree and have taken the average height of all points that fall within every square and plotted that. So this is our height map for Jedi. You already see it's cut off approximately at the height of Cambridge. That is because of the orbit of the space station. So the International Space Station is not in a polar orbit, it's tilted, and it only reaches until about 51.5 degrees north and south. But on the southern hemisphere, it doesn't matter because there are no more trees below 51 degrees south. Unfortunately for us, in Canada and in Russia, we have no reference data, and in Scandinavia, so we are extrapolating. Luckily, that works reasonably well, although the uncertainty maps, as you will see, show us that the model sees patterns there that are not as familiar as the ones in the training area. So, and now comes the third part, which is tying it all together. We have these sparse Jedi heights, well distributed, at least around the, well, say moderate and tropical areas of the Earth, not in around the Arctic. And we have images everywhere. And then it's a big engineering challenge to tie this all together. So one challenge is the sparsity. So the Jedi footprints, as is symbolized on this picture here on the right, they are sparse, which means we get information about heights, but we don't get information about height patterns. The local distribution of the heights in a little neighborhood is not known because the shots are not adjacent to each other. There are gaps in space. We thought about different ways of solving that and tried them. It turned out that nothing worked better than just brute force statistics. So just ignore it, do the supervision of your statistical system only on the central pixel of the patch where you have the height, and just let the information accumulate in a sort of unsupervised way. You still see a lot of patterns because they're just recurrent. Certain things are seen often and certain never happen. So you learn about the layout of things, and that is sufficient to give you a reasonable system. So attempts to improve that didn't really make it better, so I'm not going to talk about them. Here is actually what it really looks like. So this is the true distribution, so that you see the sparsity of those Jedi heights. So you have those in the middle, that's Jedi. You have those tracks of the laser scanner with a few dots. Along them, we extract patches that you see at the bottom. So that's for every dot, a patch that is centered on the dot. And that is the data collection we work with for training, because there we have the target values. And then again, we run train multiple networks so that we have this probabilistic averaging, that we get a sort of Monte Carlo approximation of Bayesian learning in some sense. And additionally, at the same time of data augmentation and bigger diversity, bigger decorrelation for the ensemble, we actually don't do this all on one image per location, but we collect images over an entire period, half a year. And we first look for the best images in there. So we keep at most 10 or less that are not very clouded, but mostly clear skies so that we see the surface. And from those, we draw randomly. So every time we do a new ensemble member and do a new prediction, we also give it a different input from the same location. And in this way, you also sample more about more diverse lighting conditions and seasons and so on. And all those go again into a deep network. It's the same one as in the first part of the talk, just a bit shallower so that it's computationally more efficient. And it outputs a mean and a standard deviation map, as you see here on the right, where, this is the usual color map. Yellow are high trees, purple are low trees, black is 0. And the variance just goes from black to light blue instead of to yellow so that we can keep the two apart. The variance is actually very correlated. It's often as in many geospatial problems, you get a relative behavior. So if the quantity is twice as big, then in expectation also its uncertainty is twice as big. And yeah, then we basically just collect all the Jedi shots at the time. That was 600 million. By now there's 1.4 billion, I think. We actually didn't need the 600 million. It turns out that 300 were enough, and then the thing had converged. And we grabbed all the Sentinel tiles of the entire world for 5 months. And then it's a lot of data pre-processing and crunching. And of course, we also split it. So we wanted to have an, as one should, an independent validation set. And we did that at the tile level. So on the right, bottom right, you see the validation tiles. Those were the regions that we held out of our training and only used to evaluate the model, but it had never seen those places. They are entire Sentinel tiles. So 1 by 1, 100 by 100 kilometers, so that there would be a bit of geographical decorrelation too. Well, yeah, and then there are some engineering tricks. I don't want to bore you with those, but just to give you a bit of a feeling. So one thing that's really important is there's a very skewed distribution, long tail, as so often in nature. There are lots and lots of low vegetation, but there are fairly few trees with 50 or 60 or 70 meters. And therefore your training is biased against those because there are few of those. And if you make an error there, it doesn't hurt as much as if you make a small error in a very frequent height class. So you have to do some clever rebalancing, but not too strong. And the ensembling actually also helps a lot there to improve the, or to mitigate the underestimation of very high canopies with only paying a very small penalty of 1 meter or 2 in terms of overestimation for small canopies. And on top of that, there's another trick that for geospatial data works very well often, and that is to put in geographic priors. So we do this in a very primitive way. We encode the location on Earth in a CNN-friendly manner. That is, for the longitude, you have to take some sort of a sine cosine encoding to make sure that closing the circle works, and we tell the model where it is, and in this way it can learn regional distributions. Stuff like if you're in the middle of the Amazon, the a priori likelihood of a high tree is much bigger than if you're in Russia. Good, and then we applied it, which is a big number crunching exercise, took about 3 GPU years of compute, which sounds a lot, and indeed it is a lot. It's about as much carbon production as if I had driven to Cambridge by car, but not back. But compared to what people nowadays, of course, do with language models and so on, it's still quite negligible. And we deployed this over the entire Earth and created this map, which is online. It's publicly available. Either to view it, the most convenient option is on Google Earth Engine, but we also provide the tiles in the same cropping as the CCI maps if you want to use it professionally in your own GIS system. And I can't do the map justice with this visualization because I have to zoom out so far that it looks that you don't even see the high resolution. So here's an example of what it really shows. This is from West Papua, Indonesia, so the Indonesian part of New Guinea. And what this big purple patch is a region in the rainforest that they're clear cutting, unfortunately, probably for palm oil. And here on the bottom left of it, or on the left side of it, you see this weird grid pattern. Those are the access roads. So they have not yet cut down the trees, but they have already cut in the roads or the cuttings, these narrow clearings to move out the timber. So that's what you can see in a 10 or say effectively 25 due to Jedi, but in a 10 or 20 meter order of magnitude resolution map compared to a kilometer. So this is actually important for certain applications. Okay, the uncertainty, we don't have to talk about that now. Quick glance at some applications. For Southeast Asia, we took a map like that and we mapped it on further to biomass, which is a much more interesting quantity, but a lot harder to map because it's harder to get good reference data. In northern Borneo, Sarawak, Greg Asner did a mapping with laser scanning. Unfortunately, it's a bit dated. It's from about 2009 or so, but we could get our hands on that data and build on the tree height to further map that to biomass. We couldn't map directly to biomass because it's not enough biomass data. And the tree height, the many additional supervision signals from all those known heights outside of the small airborne laser scanning area affords this thing more statistical strength. And then we combined it with our other maps of oil palm production and coconut production and with the global settlement layer. And we made a map that shows the categories of this high carbon stock approach, so that you know the carbon stock value of the forests for Indonesia and the Philippines and Malaysia, which together is about 2 million square kilometers. Here about the temporal consistency of the map. So we went back to California. We created a tree height map for 2019 and one for 2021, only locally to save compute. And then we compared them. And as you know, in 2020, there were big wildfires in California that have been mapped by the forest department. So we had a reference to compare to. On the right side, you see this example. So the red to blue is the difference map between our before and after. So blue means it's lower than after than it was before. So probably the trees burned down or fell. And red would mean they're higher. And the black line, the black boundary, is the one that has been denoted by the forest department. And as you can see, they match pretty well. Actually, ours is slightly more detailed, which is understandable because mapping at a pixel level by hand is fairly tedious. Okay, with that, I'm at the end. That was the story of how you sort of spent 4 years of your life making a canopy map. It's even been made into art. These 3 panels that you see here have been exhibited today at the Art and Science AI exhibition here in Zurich. So I'm showing them also to you. But with this, I'm at the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. We have time for questions, but before that, I should say I really wish you were here, Konrad, because there's, I think, several of us would love to spend many hours talking to you about each one of your slides. Absolutely. I think we use a lot of Jedi and the tree height, the biomass is something we're really working on. So we miss you. I hope you will come here. But with that, any questions? Yeah, Orlando.
So you mentioned how frustrating, in a sense, it was that you don't know how the model is working with these Sentinel-2 RGB images to classify the canopy height. What methods have you explored to try and sort of get to the bottom of what it's doing?
Well, this is a bit the issue, right? With deep machine learning, there are people who speak of explainable AI, but it's really not explainable. It's more sort of hand-wavy explanations. We have looked into the activation maps, where you can automatically filter through all your activation maps and have some criteria on, for example, their entropy and so on, and find some that look informative. And of course, you do find some that sort of, which I say, they confirm your expectations. So there's probably also a confirmation bias. If you look long enough, you, for example, find one activation map somewhere in that network that actually detects the water. And that makes sense, because it's good to know that if there's a river or a lake, there should be a tree height of 0. But of course, that is by itself not an explanation of what the model does. It just says that it has some intermediate variables, which obviously it has to have. So we've also looked into, trying to, what does it do in different regions or in different seasons? But I have to tell you, I still don't know how to find out what the model really does. It is a bit of black magic, because even very experienced experts who are, academics working on tropical ecology, if I show them this Sentinel image and also show them the infrared channel if they want, they have no chance. They cannot guess whether the trees are 30 or 60 meters high. So it is not really known how it's done in some sense. In some regions, they can say this is probably a rather tall stand and this is a lower one, but it is not something that it's one of those things that are hard to explain, among others, because we have no experience with them. Our own perception system is not good for them, because in evolutionary terms, guessing tree height from satellite images is not something that gives you a survival edge. So there's no reason to learn that as a biological organism.
Thank you. Any other? Yes.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on how you validated on areas where you didn't have the Jedi ground truth. You mentioned both Canada and Russia are not within the orbit of the International Space Station. And I wondered, do you mostly leave the fact that, that is really kind of spatial extrapolation? Do you leave that up to the high predictive uncertainty in the final output map? Or do you have some way that you looked a little bit more closely and kind of did kind of similar sanity checks as you did, like for instance with.
So we did check that
California.
against independent ground truth, not only outside, but also outside the GEDI coverage. So we took the Elvis campaigns of these Elvis campaigns. So this is essentially airborne LiDAR. This is gold standard tree height, but not from GEDI, although it was used at some point to calibrate GEDI in part. But this is relatively independent, and several of those are in Alaska, for example. So there we did compare it. And in Alaska, it was an interesting situation because the predictions were actually pretty good. They were very close to the ground truth, to this independent control, but they still were flagged as having a high uncertainty because the model didn't feel comfortable with the patterns. It didn't recognize stuff, basically, but it still guessed well enough. In Siberia, unfortunately, we have not got any independent data. It's very, very difficult to get your hands on any LiDAR data from there. And what we observed there, by comparing it to maps and so on, was that the patterns are correct. So the relative tree heights, where the higher and the lower stands, are correct, but there are some global offsets that we unfortunately get in some places. You see these at the tile boundaries. If you process every, we have to have a sort of process per tile because the thing is too big. You cannot put the entire Earth in one inference. And at the border of the GEDI tiles, where the lighting effects and these things change a little bit, or which images were used, you sometimes see a sort of a consistent jump along the seam. It's not gigantic, but it is clearly a bias that shouldn't be there. We have no way of checking it there because we don't have any independent reference, unfortunately. So that remains for the future. We actually had a plan or had an attempt to fuse in another space product from IceSat, the IceSat 2. That's also a laser altimeter with a different operating principle. It's optimized for the ice sheets and the sea ice. Therefore, the signal in vegetation is extremely noisy. And we tried to somehow, register that together with the GEDI to have something there. But unfortunately, we so far didn't manage to get anything out of there that I'm confident enough to show you.
And like when you released, this product of like a global, canopy height map, do you also package with it, these caveats of, we're relatively uncertain about the predicted output in, X, Y, and Z area, for instance, like you said, Siberia, where you have, not very many ways to actually ground truth or validate it.
So we have, of course, fully documented everything. But we have also released the full uncertainty map. So our uncertainty is not just we're uncertain in Alaska. Our uncertainty map is a per pixel predictive variance product. So it's the same map again, but just it doesn't show height. It shows uncertainty of height. And the two things come together as one product. So you can switch either of the two layers on or off.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for a great talk. I think a canopy height is something that we would all love to have, accurate canopy height in our day-to-day work. But I think most of the value from it comes from having time series, yearly time series of how it changed over time. So given that, I have two questions. One is, what is your intuition, or like your opinion on like, could this also generalize to Landsat, given that we have about 40 years of Landsat data? And then the second one is, what would it take, given how computationally expensive this is, how do we as a scientific community get to the point where we can get these yearly maps? Since Sentinel-2 is from 2015, what would it take for us
every
to
5 days, actually, you should get every 5 days.
Ideally, right? But also we want to be, even once...
There is a conceptual question. Do we really want to get it every 5 days? I think that wouldn't make any sense. You're even in extreme cases, except for storm damage, the growth or loss of forest within 5 days is relatively small, and the predictive uncertainty is also not negligible. So I think 5 days might be exaggerated. For certain alerts, it might make sense, but then change detection might be the better approach. If you want to do a long-term time series, I think that once or twice per year would actually easily be enough. That could be done. We're a research outfit, right? We're not an operational provider. We're not a space agency. We're not a commercial company. So once we have done it and proved and evaluated it, we'd have to hand it on. Somebody else can pick this up. The code is open source. We're also happy to support anybody who wants to do it. But every new annual map, making it and validating it is a 3-4 man-month exercise, plus the 3 compute years if you have access to a really good high-performance computing system. And to do that every year without really a, just operational production, that is, of course, not our mission. I hope that somebody picks it up. I will be happy to put in an effort to support them, but I can't make a map every year with my group. But it would be possible. We have actually tested it, for example, in California, and they are consistent enough to use them. I wouldn't dare to say you can see year-to-year changes in growth, but you can see disturbances, and you can probably see the long-term growth over 5 or 10 years. Now, coming to Landsat, that is a bit of a subtle issue. It could be done for Landsat. You'd have to retrain it from scratch. It needs to learn about Landsat, but you can take the same Jedi reference, geo-referenced Landsat with it and train it. So this exact same procedure would work. I would be pretty sure that in the interesting parts, which is in the high canopies, the product will be significantly worse. The saturation will kick in much earlier, not at 50 or 55 meters, but probably at 30 meters. I mean, this has been done for canopy height with Landsat, right? Peter Potapov did it with a random forest approach from Maryland, and they just saturate a lot earlier. And my explanation is that the strength of our system, what our system can do more than a per pixel random forest, is it texture analysis, right? The convolutional kernels allow you local texture analysis, and we have higher texture resolution than Landsat. So we have a bigger chance of seeing patterns there that are not blurred out. We've actually verified that. So we have done an experiment where we used our exact same system, same depth, same nonlinearity, but we restricted all the kernels to 1 by 1. So we operate only on the radiance measurements from a single pixel and don't look at the neighborhood distribution. And that works equally well for the low trees up to 20, 25 meters. And then for the high ones, it works a lot worse. So texture does play an important role. And I think there you would be at a certain disadvantage with Landsat. Having said that, it doesn't mean it can't be done. It actually has been done with lower accuracy than ours, but there is a map at least up to the north. They did it very local, so they didn't do a global model. They didn't dare to, but rather calibrated it locally for every tile or for every region. Therefore, it stops at the end of the Jedi at the 51° north. But there is, for the Jedi coverage, a complete map made from Landsat by the Uni Maryland group.
Thanks, that makes sense.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question. One is like for the prediction map with the highest uncertainties, do you think how to improve like the prediction accuracy? Are those regions that need more ground-based service? Another question about your slides on the nerve for the LiDAR sensors. Do you think, because I think your nerve is very memory intensive, do you think how scalable it is for large scale survey of the 3D reconstruction of forest scenes?
Okay, so 2 different questions. The first one is about the ones with the high uncertainty. Now there's, as you know, uncertainty comes from different sources. We model both the, as they say, the epistemic and the aleatoric uncertainty. The epistemic uncertainty, in theory, can be reduced by showing the models more samples of that sort. Epistemic uncertainty is uncertainty in the model weights due to not having observed something sufficiently in the training data. So that's sort of the Brave New Learning World version of systematic errors. That is a misspecification of the model because you cannot extract the right model parameters if you haven't got enough examples in a statistical system. And that, in theory, can go away if you show it more of the examples that it needs to know. That would probably mean you have to very carefully analyze where it is and try to find reference in those places. It's not easy because, for example, for high trees, it's not that we have proportionally less reference. It's just there isn't more, right? Because the area of the number of pixels that have 70-meter high trees is relatively small in the world. But you could, of course, try to make LiDAR campaigns in exactly those places where, or in north of the Jedi coverage, and try to add more data. The aleatoric uncertainty, on the other hand, by its very definition, you cannot change by collecting data. It's inherent. It's the noise level, the base noise level of the data according to the way of the natural phenomenon under it and the way it's collected. So no matter how many examples you have, there is a certain uncertainty in the definition of what is tree height and in the measurement accuracy as that you can invert it out of the LiDAR. So the ground truth by itself, even looking at the ground truth without any images, so at what you consider the truth in your learning problem, that already has an uncertainty, and that's not going to go away. So there you would really have to completely switch the measurement principle, right? You have a higher accuracy LiDAR from drones in many, many places to collect reference data or something. I mean, technically there are possibilities, but logistically at this point, I don't see how to realistically go about it. Coming back to the NERF, what was the question again? You were thinking about doing NERFs of forest scenes.
You mentioned that you have developed some NERF algorithm to, has that been applied to like the simulation, the autonomous driving, like the NERF of the sensors?
I mean, it was developed for this, for simulation and autonomous driving, and we've simulated entire trajectories. But it is, of course, to some degree expensive. It's computationally expensive because NERF is not a learning system in the conventional sense. It's not like you go offline, you learn your prior, and then you run in feed-forward mode, but it's actually an optimization approach. You rerun the optimization for every single scene, just the parameterization of the model happens to follow the structure of a neural network. But you always run in training mode, essentially, right? You train for every new scene. So therefore, it is computationally expensive. It can be done for entire trajectories, but of course, you just need compute. In this case, especially also you need time because it's relatively technically challenging to split one volume up over multiple GPUs. So
I had one last question for you about the Jedi RH98 product. I mean, you said you've done your own canopy height because you didn't feel RH98 or at least the Jedi approach was very good. Could you contrast your values with the RH98 and compare the two? Where do they differ?
We have compared ours. I don't have it here, and it's a while ago, and I have to refer you to the paper. But ours are, in some cases, the best Jedi model is as good or better. But you need an oracle to know which one is the best. So when we compare against all 5 Jedi models, sometimes one of them is better. But Jedi didn't tell you that which one was going to be the one that's better. So you have a bit of an issue of trial and error and hoping that you pick the right one. Having said that, I mean, time flies and progress in science is fast these days. The Jedi team have actually released a new version of their RH98 product. I haven't looked at it in detail, but according to Ralph Dubaya, it is a lot better than the previous one. They seem to have fixed some remaining co-registration errors between the calibration waveforms from Airborne and the Jedi. So perhaps we could get away without having to do this middle part of recalibrating the retrieval of height of RH98 from the raw waveforms. At the time, it was a bottleneck. It was a roadblock for us. So we decided to just do it. But that doesn't mean that they are doing a bad job. It probably just took them longer to get to something that really worked. And we didn't have the time to wait because Nico by now has graduated. So I couldn't use the new product now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the extra time. Great, that brings us to the end of the seminar. Thank you very much. I hope we will definitely see you in person and do keep in touch. We would love to follow up with you. I think several of us are going to be writing to you with more questions and more ideas to share. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure. Thank you.